By the time the Boeing B-29 Superfortress entered combat in the Pacific, it was already being called the most advanced bomber ever built. It flew higher, farther, and faster than anything that had come before it, carrying heavier bomb loads across distances that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. But beneath its sleek aluminum skin and futuristic pressurized compartments, the B-29 was a machine pushed to its absolute limits, operating in an environment that punished both metal and men without mercy. The Pacific Theater, with its vast stretches of open ocean, isolated island bases, brutal heat, and relentless mechanical strain, turned every mission into a test of endurance not just for the aircrews, but for the aircraft themselves. The B-29 was designed to bring the war directly to Japan. Operating primarily from the Marianas, Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, these bombers flew missions that often exceeded 3,000 miles round trip. Once airborne, there was no turning back. A crippled aircraft could not simply divert to a friendly airfield. For many crews, the only options were to limp home or ditch into the ocean. The margin for error was razor thin, and the smallest mechanical failure could cascade into disaster over the course of hours in the air. At the heart of the B-29's troubles were its engines. The Wright R-30-350 duplex Cyclone radial engines were powerful, but notoriously temperamental. They ran hot, especially in the tropical climate of the Pacific, and engine fires were a constant threat. Oil leaks, overheating cylinders, cracked cowl flaps, and blown seals plagued crews from the moment the aircraft entered service. Early B-29 losses were so severe that crews grimly joked the plane was more dangerous than the enemy. Entire bomber groups were grounded repeatedly, while engineers scrambled to fix design flaws that could not be fully resolved during wartime. And yet, the missions continued. Every successful strike against Japan depended not only on the pilots and bombardiers, but on the ground crews, who worked through the night under floodlights, patching damage, replacing engines, and improvising solutions with whatever materials were available. These men were mechanics, engineers, riggers, and crew chiefs, many barely out of their teens, tasked with keeping one of the most complex machines in the world flying under impossible conditions. Among the most valuable tools in their arsenal was something deceptively simple: olive cloth tape, officially designated as Department of Utilities cloth tape. Soldiers quickly gave it a more fitting nickname: 100-mile-an-hour tape. Waterproof, flexible, and incredibly adhesive, it was originally designed to seal ammunition boxes. But in the Pacific, it became something else entirely. It patched bullet holes, secured loose panels, reinforced crack seams, sealed oil leaks, and held together aircraft that had no business being airborne. Improvisation was not optional. It was survival. B-29 crews regularly returned from missions riddled with flak damage. Shrapnel tore through fuselages, shredded control surfaces, and peeled back aluminum skin like paper. In theory, such damage required extensive depot-level repairs. In reality, mechanics often had only hours to make an aircraft airworthy again before the next mission. Replacement parts were scarce, supply chains stretched thin, and the operational tempo relentless. Some repairs were made in the open, under pounding tropical rain or choking volcanic dust. Others were performed with engines still hot, fuel fumes hanging heavy in the air. Ground crews learned quickly that perfection was the enemy of flight. The goal was not to restore the aircraft to factory condition, it was to get it airborne one more time. This culture of improvisation extended into the air as well. Many B-29s carried flight engineers who doubled as mechanics, monitoring engine temperatures, oil pressure, and fuel flow throughout the mission. If something went wrong mid-flight, there was no checklist for everything. Engineers crawled through pressurized tunnels, improvised fixes in freezing altitudes, and made judgment calls that determined whether the aircraft lived or died. Over the Pacific, damage accumulated slowly and relentlessly. A loose panel might vibrate itself free over hundreds of miles. A small oil leak could turn catastrophic hours later. A cracked cowling could increase drag just enough to push fuel consumption beyond safe limits. Each problem fed into the next, and by the time a B-29 turned for home, it was often flying on borrowed time. It was in these moments, far from land, engines straining, fuel gauges sinking, that the ingenuity of mechanics truly mattered. Tape, wire, scrap aluminum, canvas, and even parachute cord were pressed into service. Entire panels were held in place by tape alone. Oil lines were temporarily sealed to slow leaks just enough to reach land. Holes in the fuselage were patched mid-flight to maintain pressure and prevent further structural damage. The ocean below offered no mercy. Ditching a B-29 was a last resort, and survival was far from guaranteed. Crews knew that every mile flown closer to land was another chance at life. Keeping a damaged aircraft flying for hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 miles, required not only skill, but sheer stubborn refusal to give in to the situation. By 1945, stories circulated quietly among bomber groups, aircraft that should not have made it back, planes held together by tape and luck, engines that ran long past their limits. Official reports rarely captured the full truth. Improvised repairs did not fit neatly into doctrine or technical manuals, but they saved lives nonetheless. The legend of a crippled B-29 flying more than 1,000 miles over open ocean, held together by nothing more than ingenuity and duct tape, is not the story of a single miraculous moment. It is the story of a system under strain, of mechanics who understood that rules mattered less than results, and of a war where survival often depended on the simplest materials used in the smartest ways. This was not glamour. This was necessity. And over the Pacific, necessity rewrote the rules of aviation every single day. By the time the B-29 Superfortress began regular combat operations over Japan in 1944, it was already being called the most complex aircraft ever built. Nothing in the U.S. Army Air Force's inventory came close to it. Pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, advanced fire control systems, and the massive Wright R-3350 engines pushed American aviation engineering into territory that had barely been tested in peacetime. On paper, the Superfortress represented the future of strategic bombing. In reality, it was an aircraft that demanded constant improvisation just to survive its own design. The Pacific Theater magnified every weakness. Missions launched from the Marianas, Tinian, Saipan, and Guam required flights of 1,200 to 1,500 miles one way, often over nothing but empty ocean. If something went wrong, there was no divert field, no friendly coastline, and no chance of rescue for crews forced to ditch. A single loose panel, oil leak, or engine fire could turn a routine mission into a death sentence. For ground crews and flight engineers, perfection was impossible. All they could do was make the aircraft good enough to get airborne and pray it stayed together long enough to come home. The R-3350 engines were the B-29's greatest strength and its most dangerous flaw. Each produced more than 2,200 horsepower, but they ran hot, leaked oil, and had a disturbing tendency to catch fire if pushed too hard. Cylinder failures were common, and engine nacelles were packed so tightly that a single fire could spread before the crew even realized what was happening. Entire B-29s were lost not to enemy action, but to engine failures on takeoff or climb-out, exploding before they ever left friendly territory. Crews joked grimly that the most dangerous part of the mission was the first 5 minutes. When flak entered the equation, things became even worse. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was dense, but often inaccurate at high altitude, yet it didn't need to be precise to be lethal. A single jagged fragment could tear open aluminum skin, puncture oil lines, shear electrical cables, or rip loose inspection panels. The B-29's thin airframe was never designed to absorb punishment the way older bombers had been. It relied on altitude and speed for survival, not armor. When that protection failed, crews and mechanics had to compensate with ingenuity. Battle damage assessment was a constant race against time. When bombers returned from raids on Tokyo, Nagoya, or Osaka, ground crews swarmed the aircraft before the engines had even cooled. Oil streaks told stories of leaks that could have become fires. Torn metal flapped in the prop wash. Panels were missing, rivet lines blown apart, and wiring exposed to the slipstream. In many cases, the aircraft had to be turned around for another mission within days. There were no replacements waiting. Every flyable superfortress was precious. It was in this environment that 100-mile-an-hour tape became something more than a convenience. Officially designated as Department of Utilities cloth tape, it was olive drab, waterproof, and adhesive enough to bond to metal, fabric, and skin even under vibration. It had been designed for sealing ammunition crates and equipment packaging, but airmen quickly discovered it could do far more. It could hold inspection panels in place. It could seal torn fabric boots around control cables. It could temporarily secure wiring bundles ripped loose by flak. And, in extreme cases, it could be used directly on aircraft skin, not as a permanent fix, but as a desperate measure to keep airflow from ripping an already damaged airplane apart. Flight engineers often improvised repairs during missions. Unlike earlier bombers, the B-29 carried a dedicated flight engineer who monitored engine performance, fuel flow, and structural integrity while airborne. He was not just an observer. He was expected to crawl through the aircraft under combat conditions, diagnose problems, and apply whatever solutions were available. That meant tools, wire, spare clamps, rags, and yes, rolls of duct tape stuffed into toolkits wherever there was room. There are numerous documented cases of flight engineers climbing into unpressurized sections at altitude, wrapped in oxygen masks, to secure loose panels or attempt to stem oil leaks mid-flight. If a torn panel caught the slipstream, it could peel back like a tin can and take half the fuselage with it. The solution was sometimes brutally simple. Press it back into place, tape it down, reinforce it with anything that could add strength, and hope the adhesive held. Over the Pacific, these fixes weren't about making it home comfortably. They were about survival. A compromised aircraft that lost pressurization could still limp home at lower altitude, but structural failure meant total loss. Crews understood this instinctively. Every mile flown after damage was borrowed time. Every vibration could be the one that tore the aircraft open. Mechanics on the ground also played a crucial role in these survival stories. Many B-29s launched already damaged, carrying scars from previous missions that hadn't been fully repaired due to shortages of parts or time. Ground crews made judgment calls daily about what was acceptable risk. They reinforced panels with internal bracing, sealed seams with tape and compound, and cleared aircraft for missions that would have been grounded under peacetime standards. They trusted that their work, and sometimes their improvisation, would hold at 30,000 feet over hostile territory. This blurred line between ground repair and in-flight survival is where the legend of the Duct-Tape B-29 truly lives. The idea of a mechanic or flight engineer keeping a crippled superfortress airborne for over 1,000 miles is not a fantasy. It is an exaggeration of countless real incidents where small, improvised fixes made the difference between a safe landing and disappearance at sea. Tape alone did not save aircraft. But tape, combined with nerve, experience, and refusal to give up, often bought crews the time they needed. By 1945, these improvisations had become routine. They were not celebrated. They were not written up in citations. They were simply part of the unspoken reality of flying the most advanced bomber of the war across the most unforgiving ocean on Earth. When a B-29 limped back into Tinian trailing smoke, oil, and missing skin, nobody asked how elegant the repair had been. They only counted the fact that the aircraft and its crew had survived. And somewhere in those countless missions was the kind of moment this story represents. A mechanic or engineer staring at torn metal, knowing there was no proper fix available, reaching for a roll of tape, and making a choice that would decide whether a superfortress made it home or vanished into the Pacific forever. By 1945, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress had become the most complex aircraft ever fielded in combat, a technological leap so ambitious that it often felt as dangerous to its own crews as to the enemy. Designed to fly higher, farther, and faster than anything before it, the B-29 carried pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and 4 massive Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines that promised extraordinary power, but delivered chronic anxiety. The aircraft was meant to strike Japan from bases thousands of miles away, crossing endless stretches of ocean with no margin for error. In that environment, survival depended not just on pilots and navigators, but on mechanics and engineers who learned to improvise under pressure. The R-3350 engine was the B-29's greatest strength and its most persistent liability. In theory, it could generate enough power to lift enormous bomb loads to extreme altitude. In practice, it ran hot, leaked oil, and was prone to catastrophic fires if even slightly damaged. Crews joked darkly that the engines were trying to kill them, but there was nothing humorous about engine failure over the Pacific. A single malfunction could mean ditching hundreds of miles from land, with little chance of rescue. Combat damage made those risks exponentially worse. Japanese flak, even when inaccurate, could puncture engine cowlings, tear open control surfaces, or pepper the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft with holes that turned the fuselage into a pressure-leaking sieve. When B-29s began sustained operations from the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the distances involved were staggering. Missions to Tokyo and back could exceed 3,000 miles round trip. There were no emergency airfields along the way, no friendly ships positioned beneath every flight path. Once airborne, crews were committed. That reality made field repairs, both on the ground and in the air, matters of life and death. The official manuals outline repair procedures that assume time, tools, and spare parts, luxuries rarely available after a mission that returned with battle damage and overheated engines. This was where the culture of improvisation took over. Ground crews were not just mechanics. They were problem solvers working in a brutal environment of coral dust, tropical heat, and relentless operational tempo. Bombers returned riddled with holes, panels warped by heat, oil streaking along nacelles and wings. Replacement parts were limited, especially early in the campaign. Crews learned quickly that perfection was impossible. Good enough to fly often had to suffice. Into that gap stepped an unassuming but revolutionary material, olive drab cloth tape with an adhesive strong enough to bond metal, fabric, and skin, even under stress. The tape had been issued for sealing ammunition crates, but mechanics discovered it could do far more. It could be wrapped around cracked panels to reduce vibration, used to secure loose inspection doors, or applied over small punctures to slow air leakage. Over time, its reputation grew. Crews called it 100-mile-an-hour tape because it could hold together components exposed to extreme airflow. It wasn't a permanent fix, and everyone knew that. But permanence was not always the goal. Sometimes the objective was simply to get the aircraft home alive. On one long-range mission late in the war, a B-29 returned from Japan in dangerously bad shape. Flak damage had torn sections of skin near the wing root and engine nacelle, and one engine showed signs of oil loss severe enough to threaten seizure. The aircraft had landed safely, but barely. A full repair would have taken days, grounding the bomber while its crew flew with another aircraft or waited idle. Operational demands left little room for that. Intelligence targets were time-sensitive, and aircraft availability was constantly strained. A flight engineer and a small team of mechanics examined the damage under harsh floodlights. The holes were too large to ignore, but replacement panels were not immediately available. Oil seeped from a damaged line, not enough to shut the engine down on the ground, but enough to doom it on a long flight. The official solution would have been to swap engines or ground the aircraft. Instead, the mechanic made a decision born of necessity. Using cloth tape, scrap aluminum, and sealant, he constructed a temporary patch, layer upon layer of tape over metal, reinforced to smooth airflow and reduce vibration. Around the leaking line, tape was wrapped tightly, not to stop the leak entirely, but to slow it enough that oil consumption might stay within survivable limits. No one pretended this was textbook maintenance. The mechanic understood exactly what he was doing, buying time. The aircraft would not be perfect. It did not need to be. It needed to fly long enough to cross open ocean and reach land again. When the crew returned for pre-flight, they were briefed honestly. The fix was explained. The risks were understood. There was no drama, no speeches, just a shared recognition that this was how the war was fought. Once airborne, the patched B-29 climbed slowly, every crew member alert for signs of failure. Pressurization leaked through the taped sections, forcing them to fly lower than planned. Fuel consumption rose. The damaged engine ran hotter than the others, forcing careful power management. Over the vast Pacific, the aircraft droned on for hour after hour, the tape holding against wind shear, vibration, and temperature changes that would have peeled weaker adhesives away in minutes. Somewhere beneath them, nothing but water stretched to the horizon. As the miles passed, the fix proved itself. Oil loss remained steady rather than catastrophic. The patched skin held. The bomber stayed aloft. After more than 1,000 miles, land finally appeared, and the aircraft touched down safely. Only after shutdown did the crew fully absorb what had happened. The repair was examined later and replaced properly, but its success became one of many stories that circulated quietly among B-29 units. Stories not of hero pilots or dramatic dogfights, but of mechanics whose ingenuity kept men alive. These improvised repairs were never celebrated in official communiques. They did not fit the narrative of technological superiority or strategic bombing doctrine. Yet without them, the B-29 campaign might have collapsed under its own mechanical complexity. The Superfortress was a machine that demanded constant adaptation, and Duct-Tape became a symbol of that reality. It represented a mindset: use what you have, trust your judgment, and accept calculated risk in order to survive. By the end of the war, thousands of such fixes had been attempted, some successful, some not. But each one reflected the same truth. Victory in the Pacific was not achieved solely by factories and blueprints. It was won by individuals willing to improvise in the face of impossible distances and unforgiving machines, keeping fragile aircraft flying long enough to bring their crews home. By mid-1945, the B-29 Superfortress had become both the most powerful bomber ever fielded and one of the most mechanically temperamental aircraft of the war. Its Wright R-3350 engines were marvels of engineering on paper, capable of pushing the massive aircraft at unprecedented altitudes and speeds. But in practice, they were prone to overheating, oil leaks, cracked exhaust valves, and catastrophic fires. Crews feared engine trouble almost as much as enemy fighters, especially over the vast, empty reaches of the Pacific where a forced landing meant death. Every mission carried the quiet understanding that survival often depended less on combat skill and more on whether the aircraft itself decided to keep flying. The long bombing runs from the Marianas to Japan routinely exceeded 3,000 miles round trip. If a B-29 took flak damage over the target or lost an engine during the return leg, the crew faced hours of flight over open ocean with no safe diversion fields. In those moments, the aircraft's flight engineer and any on-board maintenance specialist became as important as the pilot. These men were not glamorous figures in wartime propaganda. They were grease-stained, sleep-deprived, and intimately familiar with the sounds of metal fatigue. When something failed midair, there was no manual to consult. The only question was whether it could be held together long enough to reach land. Improvised repairs during flight were officially discouraged, but unofficially expected. Crews carried toolkits, spare wiring, clamps, safety wire, rags, and rolls of olive drab cloth tape, the same duct tape, originally designed to seal ammunition boxes. Mechanics had learned that the tape could temporarily secure loose panels, reinforce torn aluminum skin, and even slow oil leaks when wrapped tightly around cracked lines. It was never meant for aviation use, and no engineer would have signed off on it, but in the Pacific War, survival often depended on what worked rather than what was approved. One recurring nightmare involved flak tearing open sections of the B-29's thin aluminum skin. Even small holes could create violent airflow at high altitude, turning minor damage into rapidly expanding tears. Panels could vibrate loose, threatening to rip away entirely, and take control cables or fuel lines with them. In such cases, crewmen would crawl through the pressurized compartments, depressurize the aircraft if necessary, and physically brace damaged sections. Tape was used to bind torn metal edges, reduce flutter, and hold patches made from canvas, insulation, or even seat fabric in place. These were not repairs in any conventional sense. They were acts of desperation carried out thousands of feet above the ocean. Engine trouble was even worse. The R-3350's tendency to leak oil meant that a cracked line could quickly drain lubrication from a cylinder bank, leading to overheating and fire. Fire extinguishers were limited, and if an engine burned long enough, it could ignite the wing. Mechanics sometimes wrapped leaking lines with layers of cloth tape reinforced by wire, rags, or even clothing, hoping to slow the leak just enough to keep oil pressure alive. These fixes were crude, dangerous, and terrifying to perform in flight, but crews did them anyway because the alternative was bailing out into the Pacific. The legend of a B-29 being held together by duct tape for over 1,000 miles does not come from a single after-action report, but from dozens of similar accounts stitched together across the Pacific theater. Mission debriefs mention temporary field repairs, jury-rigged oil lines, and structural damage stabilized in flight. Veterans later filled in the details. They remembered hands bleeding from sharp metal, the roar of wind through damaged fuselage sections, and the smell of oil and overheated engines lingering for hours. They remembered mechanics refusing to strap in, staying on their feet to monitor failing systems until land appeared on the horizon. Returning aircraft often looked barely airworthy. Ground crews at bases on Tinian, Saipan, and Guam were accustomed to seeing superfortresses limp in trailing smoke, missing panels, streaked with oil, and vibrating uncontrollably. When asked how they made it back, crews would often answer with dark humor. Tape, wire, prayers, and luck were recurring themes. What mattered was that the plane had stayed together long enough. After landing, those same makeshift repairs were often all that prevented a mid-air breakup. These experiences slowly filtered back into operational doctrine. Engineers began reinforcing vulnerable sections of the B-29. Improved cooling baffles, better fire suppression systems, and revised engine procedures reduced, but never eliminated, the need for improvisation. Still, no amount of redesign could fully remove the realities of long-range bombing over the Pacific. The distances were too vast, the margins too thin, and the machines too complex. Every successful return was a minor miracle, achieved through equal parts engineering, courage, and improvisation. The reputation of 100-mile-an-hour tape grew accordingly. It became a symbol of frontline ingenuity, a quiet acknowledgement that the war was being fought not just by pilots and generals, but by ordinary servicemen solving impossible problems in real time. Mechanics joked that if something moved and shouldn't, tape it. If something didn't move and should, hit it. Beneath the humor was the recognition that these small acts of improvisation kept aircraft and crews alive. As the war drew closer to Japan's mainland, the missions grew more dangerous, not less. Night raids, low-level firebombing runs, and heavily defended targets pushed B-29 crews to their limits. Aircraft returned riddled with damage, often held together by little more than temporary fixes applied mid-air. In many cases, those fixes meant the difference between survival and disappearance over the Pacific. What history remembers are the bombs dropped and the cities destroyed. What it often forgets are the quiet moments between target and home, when a mechanic was shaking hands wrapped cloth tape around a failing machine and hoped it would hold. Those moments rarely made headlines, but they happened again and again, and without them, Many of the B-29s that defined the air war against Japan would never have come back at all. By the summer of 1945, the B-29 campaign over Japan had reached a scale never before seen in air warfare. Hundreds of superfortresses lifted off nightly from Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, flying thousands of miles across open ocean to burn Japanese cities to the ground. The headlines would later focus on atomic bombs and famous generals. But beneath those events lay thousands of smaller survival stories that never made it into official communiques. Among them were the countless instances where damaged aircraft came home only because someone refused to accept that the situation was beyond saving. Improvisation, more than technology, often decided whether a crew lived or vanished into the Pacific. In the final months of the war, maintenance officers quietly admitted what flight crews already knew. The Wright R-3350 engines were still dangerously unreliable. Fires, oil leaks, blown cylinders, and overheating remained constant threats, especially during long overwater flights at heavy weight. Add flak damage or fighter hits, and the margin for error vanished entirely. Aircraft returning with shredded aluminum skin, torn control surfaces, or leaking systems were routine. Many never returned at all. For those that did, post-flight inspections often revealed repairs so crude they bordered on unbelievable, yet they worked. Olive drab cloth tape, still widely called duct tape by the men using it, became one of the most trusted tools on the ramp. It sealed torn skin panels, secured access hatches that no longer latched, reinforced cracked fairings, and slowed oil leaks just enough to buy time. It was not meant to withstand the aerodynamic forces of a high-altitude bomber, but in practice it often did. At cruise speed, a poorly patched hole could tear wider, but a properly layered tape patch sometimes held long enough to cross an ocean. Maintenance manuals did not approve of this. Survival demanded it anyway. Crew chiefs understood that the difference between a safe landing and a fatal ditching often came down to whether an aircraft could hold together for another hour. They also understood that no rescue forces waited beneath them once they left the Marianas. A B-29 limping home on 3 engines had no second chances. Tape repairs were not acts of desperation alone. They were calculated risks made by men who knew exactly how much strain an airframe could take and how much it could not. After the war, when historians reconstructed mission statistics, they counted losses, tonnage dropped, and targets destroyed. They did not count how many aircraft returned because oil spray had been slowed with tape, or because a flapping panel had been pinned down long enough to avoid structural failure. Yet veteran accounts repeatedly mention these moments. Flight engineers recalled crawling through the fuselage mid-flight to check patched areas, listening for changes in vibration, watching tape edges peel and praying they would hold. Pilots remembered the uneasy calm of long return legs, knowing that their aircraft was technically broken but still flying. The irony was that duct tape, born from a civilian factory worker's frustration with faulty ammunition boxes, became indispensable at the cutting edge of strategic bombing. Vesta Stout had envisioned soldiers opening crates faster under fire. She could not have imagined her idea keeping a 4-engine bomber intact at 20,000 feet. Yet that is exactly what happened, again and again, across the Pacific. When the war ended, superfortresses lined the runways of the Marianas, many scarred beyond easy repair. Some were scrapped in place, pushed into the sea, or stripped for parts. Others were ferried home for testing or conversion. Maintenance logs quietly recorded temporary fixes that were never meant to last. Tape patches were removed, replaced by riveted panels and factory repairs. Officially, these fixes were footnotes. Unofficially, they were lifesavers. As veterans returned home, duct tape followed them. Johnson & Johnson repackaged it for civilian use, and the name slowly shifted from duct to duct, even though it was never particularly good for sealing ducts. Builders, mechanics, and homeowners discovered what soldiers already knew. It worked where it had no right to work. It stuck in heat, cold, moisture, and chaos. It became shorthand for ingenuity itself. The legend of the B-29 held together by tape is not about a single named aircraft or a single heroic mechanic. It is about a culture of improvisation forged by necessity. It is about young men who understood that rules mattered less than outcomes when the alternative was death. It is about a war where the most advanced bomber ever built still depended on cloth, adhesive, and human judgment to survive. In the Pacific, distances were merciless. There were no friendly coastlines beneath damaged wings, no neutral airfields to divert to. When something went wrong, the crew fixed it or they died. Tape was not a miracle solution, but it bought time, and time was everything. 1,200 miles of ocean is an eternity when oil pressure is falling and an engine is vibrating itself apart. If tape could hold a panel closed for just one more hour, that might be the hour that mattered. Today, museums display pristine B-29s polished to perfection. Visitors marvel at their size, their engines, their bomb bays. Few displays show the field repairs, the patched skins, the tape residues scraped away after survival flights. Yet those invisible details are as much a part of the aircraft's history as any bomb load. They represent the moment when technology failed and human ingenuity stepped in. The story of a mechanic's duct tape fix keeping a crippled B-29 flying across the Pacific is not a myth, even if no single mission can claim exclusive ownership of it. It happened in fragments, in dozens of aircraft, across hundreds of missions. It happened whenever someone looked at a broken bomber and said, "It just needs to last one more flight." And sometimes, against all odds, it did. In a war defined by industrial scale and overwhelming firepower, survival often depended on the simplest solutions. A strip of cloth tape, pressed into torn aluminum by exhausted hands, became the thin line between loss and return. That quiet, unrecorded act of improvisation deserves its place alongside the grand narratives of victory, because without it,